The last presenter today is Peter Kenyon. Most of you would know who Peter Kenyon is, one of the world's leading community development authorities, who's worked in over 1,000 communities around the world in most places, most continents, and most councils around Australia have had some involvement with Peter Kenyon. Today he's going to talk about the Perth Council amalgamation process because he's also a local activist. And the Perth Council process has been going for 3 or 4 years. The state government has announced it was going to happen. They went through a long process, convoluted process, and just in the last few months, all of a sudden, it stopped. And so what happened? What caused that great sort of momentum to just stop? Peter's going to tell us the story. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much, John. I always get embarrassed with John's introductions. I can hardly wait to hear myself speak after John finishes. Can I just say, it's always great to be in Melbourne. Paul Keating had that wonderful statement. He loves being in Melbourne just to perv on the buildings. And that's how I feel. I think it's the greatest city we have in the country. Sorry about those from Sydney. But I also just want to say, as a passionate sandgroper, what a wonderful time to be here with 2 West Australian teams heading the footy. It is just so great to see the Victorians go through culture stress with 2 WA teams currently heading the footy. So it is a great time to actually be here in terms of the process. Can I say I really do approach this session with a degree of mixed emotion. Firstly, it is the graveyard session. I'll never forgive John Hennessy for that. I know most of you are like me, wanting to take off quickly. Secondly, in 25 minutes, you've asked me to unravel what I think is a fairly complicated, shambolical story. And certainly I speak as a community enthusiast. I speak as a citizen who got involved in my community, trying to save my community. And I'm aware that in the audience here, you've got people who could speak much more effectively about the role of local government. People like Lynn Russell, the CEO of Canning, and Mayor Sue Doherty from South Perth. People like that, if you're interested in the details, particularly its impact on local government, they would be the people that you need to talk to. But I am excited to be here for one reason, and that is that on the 10th of February was one of the great days of my life. On the 10th of February, our Premier, in his own words, raised the white flag in what was, I think, one of how not to do it type exercises that actually went on. His own words, he ran up the white flag. It's interesting to see, and this is directly out of the ABC website from the 10th of February, he delivered this as he was about to walk into one of those Liberal Party member love-in sessions down in Busselton. It was the end of a terrible weekend for the Liberal Party. They had just lost Queensland. They had Tony Abbott at his lowest ratings. And obviously, it came at the end of where several councils who had the right to call a poll on the amalgamation all voted overwhelmingly against it. And so our Premier on that day raised the white flag. I find the type of words that he actually used quite interesting. And in many ways, the language he used on that day gives you some insight why this was such a failure in terms of it. I love these 2 statements. So it became a shambles. It became a shambles. I accept responsibility, but I don't think I deserve the blame. Is that an oxymoron? The system is broken. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. So very difficult to get sensible reform. Again, throughout this whole exercise, he did not talk about amalgamation, but reform. And this is really the total opposite, the process, in terms of what the reform was actually all about. Let me quickly give you a potted history of what is going to happen, what did happen in WA. In fact, it goes back 10 years when then the local minister for local government instigated an inquiry on what was called government structure and electoral reform. And it's interesting that that particular report said, we don't actually need a lot of change to make it work, but there are areas. After 100 years, there is a need to restructure boundaries, and there is a need to get some reform going. But it was actually quite moderate in what it was actually proposing. Then the state government commissioned this famous report called the Robson Report, which came out with 30 recommendations, including one that the number of metropolitan local governments should be slashed from 30 to 12. Let me say it was only one of 30 recommendations. Most of the other recommendations were totally ignored, and this is the one that the government particularly focused upon. The famous statement by the Premier, again, the language is kind of like quite contradictory the whole time. There is going to be reorganisation one way or another, and then goes on to say we're not going to override people, and so he gives that type of language. The process was anything but that. This was a top-down, outside-in, I know what's best. He used a certain Mr. Jeff Kennett as one of his main advisors in designing the process. You can imagine what actually then happened. The state government, in a way, ignored some of the recommendations of the Robson, and they moved from 30 to 16. And it's quite interesting that within Western Australia, we have a thing that I'll mention in a few minutes called the day door poll provision, which allows any community that has actually proposed for amalgamation to have a referendum on it, whether they agree. You've got to get at least 250 signatures, you've got to get at least 50% of people out to vote, and obviously you've got to get a majority of people to vote against it if you want to stop it. To avoid that being triggered, the language changed, and so it became known as boundary change, where instead of it being an amalgamation, one council had its boundaries extended to absorb another. And so it could technically get around the famous day door kind of like poll provision. There was a local government advisory group set up that very much was there to rubber stamp really what the minister was actually proposing. Councils were told that they had to put up proposals that fitted the government's agenda right from the start. And then, as we know, the process kind of like collapsed when, in their stupidity, they did allow a set of councils to have day door, where the vast majority were denied it. For some reason, they allowed a few to do it. And to their amazement, they all overwhelmingly voted against it, which stuffed up the whole process. And it was following that weekend that the Premier made his famous white flag kind of like statement. The day door proposal amendment comes from this former member for Subiaco. He was a city councillor as well as the local member for Subi. He was also the club doctor for the Subi Footy Club for 50 years. A passionate resident of Subi, a very passionate person who was an absolute pain in the butt to the Liberal Party. And he, with the support of the opposition, moved an amendment to the local government called the day door poll provision, which, as I said, allowed any affected residents the opportunity, if they could get the numbers, to call a referendum. And this is what really scared the government. They moved to have that eliminated from the Local Government Act. They were able to get through the lower house, but in the upper house, they suddenly run into trouble when some of their own members and some of the members of the National Party objected to this basic attack on democracy. And that, again, was an important thing. Can I say, from my observation, there really fundamentally were 6 critical reasons why this whole process was a shambles and why it actually failed. And first and foremost, the whole process was flawed from the start. Never was the community or anyone provided with a business plan. There was never a rationale for what they were doing. There was never an explanation of all this so-called cost savings and where the benefits would go. There was also a very strong perception, driven by some stupid comments by certain members of the government, that it was really driven by the development lobby and what we call the so-called economic arguments. Constantly, the goalposts were changed in the process. There was this bullying, as I said, councils having to submit proposals for what they wanted under very much duress. There was very poor communication processes. And sadly, there was a lot of playing councils off against each other. It was incredibly divisive. I think the Mayor, Ron Norris from Mosman Park, really summarised very well in his words the whole process. The tragic of Premier Colin Barnett's fixation on council reform is that he has rendered the residents and ratepayers of our communities irrelevant to the changes he is forcing on them. It seems as if Mr Barnett believes the role of local government is to serve developers. It is not. It is to serve its communities. By deleting the day-door provisions of the existing Local Government Act, Mr Barnett has disenfranchised our communities. And so he goes on. And I think the spirit expressed by that mayor very much was then captured by people who lived in the communities. The government had no understanding of what they suddenly faced in terms of community outrage, and the community certainly rose. As I said, there was this play-off against each other. I'm from the Shire of Kalamunda. We were being merged with what was called the City of Belmont. Again, it became a battle between the two. And again, the type of literature, the type of debate, the type of discussion became quite bitter. And so we had community neighbours starting to very much be in conflict with each other. It's also interesting to see that the government totally ignored what the evidence was telling us. And certainly here, people like Brian Dollery, who's done such extensive work, and his recommendation is overwhelmingly stating that forced amalgamation isn't the way to go forward. The way to go forward is to look at creative ways in terms of resource sharing. And so we had evidence after evidence. A major report came out in the midst of it from Ontario, where 30 years after major forced amalgamations there, we saw that after 30 years, the Canadian government in Ontario said it failed miserably. None of that was given any credence by the government. And then this whole thing that somehow big is better and somehow we're falling behind. I currently belong. The Shire of Kalamunda is 61,000 people. By 2030, we will be 100,000, and we were being told we were too small to survive the future. Well, the reality is that the future seems to work pretty well. In fact, Australia has the fourth biggest size local governments in the world. 101 community development. People do not live in an economy, they live in community. And the government totally ignored that. The whole push was this is good somehow for economic and for planning kind of like purposes. The second reason I believe it failed is simply because of hypocrisy and what I call stupidity. And again, there was a whole pile of issues there that could be actually elaborated on. The government clearly went to the 2013 state election making comments like, there will be no forced council amalgamations. The Liberal Party does not support forced amalgamations. And yet within 12 months, this is exactly what they were doing. The electorate does not respond to that type of double talk. It does not respond to threats. Our local member for Kalamunda, who seemed to be missing in action when we needed him to be standing up for us, the third most powerful person in the government, the leader of the government on the floor in the lower house, came out saying, you know what, the council is planning to have a referendum on this. If you do it, then all that money we promised you during the election could be taken away from you because you're wasting ratepayers' money. You don't deserve what we promised you. That type of kind of like language, all it did was to throw fuel onto the fire. The reality is that it just did not get traction, certainly with the wider community. And certainly, again, certain silly, stupid comments. The one about developers. The minister on the steps of Parliament confronted by 6,000 angry people screaming, telling people they were all misinformed. I mean, you've got to be a wise man or a stupid man to tell 6,000 people they are all kind of like misinformed. When asked about the government's meagre contribution, how were they going to spend the $5 million in the first year helping this process, when he announced it would be given to some consultants to work out how much the whole exercise was going to cost, did not at all go down well with the electorate. And by far, the thing that stung the electorate was just simply how unfair the process became. Those dark areas were ones who said, you can be amalgamated. You can, therefore, have the opportunity to exercise the day-door amendment. Those of you in orange, sorry, you're not being amalgamated. We're changing the language. You are having a boundary adjustment. Therefore, you are not entitled to use the day-door amendment. Certainly that type of kind of like lack of equity and fairness, again, basically undermine the whole process. And again, simple community development 101 is don't tamper with fundamental democratic rights of the citizens. Amazing how many members, active members of the Liberal Party, changed sides and supported the no approach, opposed their own government simply because they saw this as a major threat to democracy. The third thing was just simply the financial issues. Here is the state government telling local government, we think you should get your house in order, we think you should be much more efficient, we think you should use your money much more effectively, and yet this is the state government that has just gone through the greatest resource boom the country has ever seen, and there's absolutely no legacy to show. It is a government where debt has ballooned out from 3 billion to 47 billion in the life of it. And again, as we've seen in the recent budget, budget handed down, significant increased power, water, emergency services levy going up 10%. Right in the midst of all of this, the government announces that its attempt to get within its own ranks to bring together all the services, one big kind of like office of shared services. Let's amalgamate how government does its work. And they had to admit that it was a total failure, and that whole exercise was closed down, again, at huge loss to the government. There was no recognition by the government of the contradiction and hypocrisy in terms of how all this stuff happened. There was also incredible anger over the whole merge of funds. It was estimated by Welga that the amalgamation would cost between 65 but probably close to 100 million. Some of us believe that the true figure was closer to 200 million. The Bear of Belmont, who we were being forced into amalgamation with, believed that the amalgamation of Belmont and Kalamunda would cost $15 million. And for him, in the first year, that would be a 38% rate increase to cover it. Again, the government's response is, we will give you 15 million for 3 years, 5 million a year to help, and there is an interest loans of 45 million available. Not free money, a loan money with an interest attached. That was their $60 million contribution. You can imagine the reaction that got within local government. And the fact that simply the evidence is pointed out elsewhere, and we only have to look at Queensland and we only have to look at overseas evidence to see where amalgamation costs went. The average cost of amalgamation in the Queensland one's around $8 million per council. And that was the type of thing that we were being forced. And within one, and we've heard a bit about Geraldton today, it is a fantastic place, Ken, but the reality is there that particular cost was around $12.4 million when that was actually amalgamated. The fourth area why this thing failed was very much the internal Liberal Party and within the coalition kind of like dissent that went on. The National Party certainly didn't come out well. They agreed to support their Liberal partners in this exercise on the proviso that they didn't do the same in the bush. We'll allow you to do it in the city only if you promise not to do it in the bush. I don't really find that the most ethical kind of like position to stand upon. And then what's happened within the Liberal Party was just absolutely amazing, where member after member started to get cold feet and begin to very much question the process. And the classic was in Mayor Sue's kind of like area of South Perth, where the member for South Perth at one of the community meetings in South Perth got up and made these unbelievable statements. I urge this meeting to come out very strongly and oppose what the government is doing in this amalgamation process, because I think the people have been led up the garden path. It is trickery. Now, not only is he the member for South Perth, he's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier. You can imagine next morning over morning tea, the reaction of the Premier when his Parliamentary Secretary comes out with a statement like that. And so the wheels certainly started to fall off in terms of the whole thing. It was trickery with language, it was an affront to democracy, and that started to really bite deep into the whole thing. The fourth thing that particularly came together, and luck always plays a role, why did the Premier suddenly raise the white flag? Well, on that weekend, firstly, those three areas that he allowed to have the poll all voted overwhelmingly, so suddenly he was faced by the fact it wasn't working. But I suspect even more significantly was the Queensland state election, where here an elected group only 3 years earlier, the greatest political win in the country, lose office. And again, he suddenly could see the writing on the wall, and at the same time, the popularity of the Prime Minister was pretty low. But the final factor, and the one that I really just want to finish with and highlight, is what I call the people, power and rage factor. And certainly in WA, that was incredibly significant. Local people suddenly found an issue that they could get excited about. Suddenly people were prepared to take risks they'd never thought of. And I suppose I love that quote from probably the guru on community development, Margaret Wheatley, who said, "There's no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. There's no greater asset in a community than kind of like what is it that people really care about." And suddenly this was an issue that people really cared about. In my community, it was about 115 years of heritage and tradition just being wiped away. We are like the Adelaide Hills, we are like the Blue Mountains, and suddenly we're being amalgamated with a council 1 kilometre outside the city centre, an urban kind of like area, nothing in common in terms of really lifestyle or values or whatever. And so people rallied to that particular thing. And the other comment that Margaret Mead makes, determination, energy and courage appear spontaneously when we care deeply. We take risks that are unimaginative in any other context. And I suppose I just admire kind of like across the metropolitan area, local community people became really the warriors in this campaign. Local mayors and councils recognised the wisdom of stepping back and allowing their residents to actually go into battle. And in our case, a very effective local community development group very quickly came together that certainly gave energy. Their simple message was no, this is not a process that we actually want, and we certainly are saying strongly we want to vote, and certainly we want to be able to tell the government we want the status quo. And so what happened across the metropolitan areas was kind of like meeting after meeting where people came together and began really overwhelmingly to say, we object to this particular process. As I said, up to 6,000 people suddenly gathered on the kind of like the steps of Parliament, basically saying, listen, we just hate the process that you're actually putting in place. We object really strongly. There were individuals like this guy, Ian Kerr, who so passionate about it, a former councillor, I think in one of the inner city suburbs there, he was prepared to personally put his own money up to take a legal action, a legal challenge to the whole thing. People were prepared to kind of like step up. The former leader of the Liberal Party, Bill Hassel, in Western Australia, was prepared to be identified. And in my state, in my community, 2 ex-former members of the Liberal Party parliamentary team were prepared to stand with us, saying we do not like the process and we do not like what this government is actually about. It came down to old-fashioned community organising. People started to mount their kind of like card tables and their posters at the farmers market. They started to kind of like recruit people. They started mobilising people. They started using social media. They organised buses to bus people into Parliament. And suddenly the government, without expecting it, suddenly faced this tidal wave of kind of like community opposition. In my community, an incredibly effective, wherever you went, you got forced with these kind of like banners. And we loved it that every day John Day had to drive up the hill, seeing this day after day. I love those two, not happy Colin, you know, but I love that other one, forced colonisation. One of the great things about community organising, it needs to be fun. And I tell you, this group had a huge amount of fun in terms of the whole process and whatever. But again, people were prepared to fund this type of stuff, work on it, repair them when they got damaged, when kind of like people who opposed us kind of like tore them down. People were prepared to get out there and constantly service what they call these eyes in the field. One of the most interesting initiatives by my own group was to organise what was called the burial of democracy. The day that the Supreme Court challenge happened, there was a funeral procession right along the main road of Perth, St George's Terrace. And again, it got a huge amount of media. Again, it's the type of thing that just eats away at the thing. And if you can get people to laugh, you can get people to see what it's on. As John Cleese said, you're halfway there to getting people convinced that you're on about something good. And as kind of like Mayor Sue Doherty, who was here today, on hearing the result on that Saturday night in her own kind of like city, in terms of the fact that over 50% of people were prepared to vote on it, when you consider we rarely get over 30%, where there were 75% plus people. And again, I think Sue captures very well the critical issues behind that particular campaign. But it wasn't just in South Perth, it wasn't just in Kalamunda, it was actually across. There were these groups everywhere. I love the one, Lynn, from your area, Save Kenyon, Cull Barnett, and that became a very popular slogan there and so on. But ordinary people stood up to kind of like make a difference, gave their time and, let me say, their own money to kind of like fund these type of campaigns. And certainly it was a massive party organised by the Mayor of Subi when that announcement came through, and particularly because the orders to the government had already been instigated, the government had to reverse all of that. And following that, there was an incredible party when the government realised the whole thing was just a failure. So what is the future? Yes, there is a need for reform. After 115 years, yes, some boundaries need to change. No one denies that. Yes, there needs to be some more effectiveness, but there needs to be a proper process. It needs to be done without the bullying. It needs to be done with consultation. It's interesting to see that the Premier and the Minister for Local Government issued this particular press release following the decision to wind it all up and to revoke those governor's orders. I like this particular booklet that currently in New Zealand, in the Hawke's Bay area, there's a move for massive amalgamation. I love what the locals have put out there. Amalgamation is not the answer. There is a better way to Hawke's Bay, and it just seems to me that we do need to look much more creatively at resource sharing, look at more effective ways of where we can retain our sense of community identity and yet benefit from kind of like sharing with our neighbours when it comes to resources and so on. And certainly within the eastern part of the city where I'm based, councils there have already taken up that challenge, and we're already beginning to see some effective partnerships, even between Kalamunda and Belmont, who were then forced in becoming enemies in the whole process. Can I say that one of the things that was incredibly divisive in this whole process was because we were denied that Daydor amendment and we were forced into what was called boundary change, the government decided that Kalamunda, despite being 50% bigger than Belmont, would be absorbed by Belmont, by the city of Belmont. As from the 30th of June of this year, the reigning councillors in Kalamunda would be dismissed, and for 4 months, only the councillors in Belmont would actually rule over the new joined-up council. They would obviously then make decisions about name, about how they were going to pay for it, what services were going to be slashed, how ward boundaries would be created. Can you think of anything more kind of like undemocratic than that type of action? Can you think of anything that would actually set up a poison between two neighbouring councils than that type of decision-making that was actually made by the state government? Can I say, finally, 2 things? One is that as someone who was out there in shopping centres and running a whole pile of workshops, overwhelmingly the people who said, I don't agree with you. I agree that this amalgamation is a good thing. can I say that in over 90% of cases, when you pushed them on why, it was simply because they were fed up with the type of local government they've currently got. And in their mind, the devil they don't know would have to be better than the devil they do know. And they were voting for this new arrangement because they could not stand the way they were currently being managed. There is a need for local government to reconnect with their communities. There is a need for local government to begin to move from red tape to red carpet in terms of how they begin to deal with the residents within their community. And it's 10 years ago that one of these conferences organised by the MAV came out with a number of kind of like consensus statements, and I love two of them. One is that a precondition for better future local government needs to engage with and win the respect from the community. And so my message, particularly to my own shire, is listen, we've won this, but now's the time to rebuild your relationship with your ratepayers and your citizens. And that the second key leadership role of local government is to enable democratic local decision-making and actions on behalf of community. Can I say that one of my favourite quotes is this: most communities can compare an Australian rules football match where 30,000 people who need the exercise turn up to watch 36 players who don't. And I tend to think that so much of local government is run like that. We've got to change that. We've got to stop treating people as customers and as consumers of our services. We've got to start creating opportunities for our residents to truly become citizens and co-producers of the futures that they're part of. And finally, can I say that what really scares me is that we do have a state government that does not seem to have learnt too many lessons. We're about to close up to, and we're not sure of the number because none of that's ever revealed in detail, 150 Indigenous communities and force those people to move into larger urban towns. I love that particular cartoon that appeared in the West Australian. And it just seems to me that this government has failed to learn what true consultation and creating a future with people and with communities is actually all about. I was hoping that what we have gone through, which has been one of the saddest and most shambolical processes that you could ever imagine, that there would have been lessons to have been learnt. When it comes to this important issue about the future of our Indigenous communities, people out on their country where they have desired to live, we seem to be heading down the same track as we did with kind of like local government. Thank you very much.